The moment you go silent, you don't disappear from a narcissist's mind. You multiply because your silence doesn't bring them peace. It activates panic, obsession, and a kind of regret that has nothing to do with love. If this is helping you understand the psychology behind their silence, pause for a moment and subscribe. Because clarity is your power, and the more you understand this dynamic, the less it controls you. When silence triggers narcissistic injury, it does not create thoughtful reflection, it creates a wound. The concept of narcissistic injury, described by psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, refers to the intense emotional pain that arises when a person's inflated self-image is punctured. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, their identity depends heavily on external validation. They regulate their self-worth through admiration, attention, compliance, and emotional reactions from others. When you suddenly go silent, you are not just withdrawing communication, you are withdrawing affirmation, and that feels like an attack. To a psychologically secure person, silence might signal distance, conflict, or the need for space. To a narcissistic mind, silence signals humiliation. It says, "You are not important enough to engage with." That perception cuts deeply because their self-concept is fragile beneath the grandiosity. The confident exterior is often compensatory, so when you stop responding, their nervous system reacts as if they have been rejected publicly. What follows is not introspection, it is defense. Instead of thinking, "What did I do to cause this?" the mind rapidly moves toward ego protection. Blame becomes the shield. You are labeled dramatic, immature, cold, or unstable. This cognitive reframing reduces the threat to their self-image. If you are flawed, then their superiority remains intact. If you are unreasonable, then they are still in control of the narrative. At the same time, there is an undercurrent of panic. Silence removes their ability to manage the dynamic. They cannot charm you, argue with you, provoke you, or extract reassurance. The loss of control intensifies the injury. Control for them equals safety. Without access to you, their internal instability becomes louder. This is why your silence feels so powerful. It forces them to confront a gap where validation used to be, and that gap exposes vulnerability they are structured to avoid at all costs. When loss of control sets in, the narcissistic mind does not experience it as a simple relational shift. It experiences it as destabilization. Control for a person with strong narcissistic traits is not just about dominance, it is about emotional regulation. Their sense of stability often depends on being able to predict, influence, and shape the reactions of others. When you go silent, that predictability collapses. At first, there is confusion. They may test the waters with a casual message, a subtle probe, or indirect monitoring through social media. When those attempts fail to produce a response, anxiety rises. The absence of feedback creates psychological freefall. Without your reactions, positive or negative, they lose one of their primary tools for maintaining their self-concept. This destabilization activates defensive strategies. Some respond with anger. Anger restores a sense of power. If they can frame you as disrespectful or cruel, they regain moral high ground in their own narrative. Others escalate charm or vulnerability, attempting to reestablish influence. The shift can be dramatic because the underlying goal is the same: regain equilibrium. What makes this destabilization intense is that it touches on a deeper insecurity. Many narcissistic patterns are built on an unstable foundation of self-worth. Grandiosity acts as armor. Control over others reinforces that armor. When you remove yourself from the dynamic, the armor feels thinner. They cannot regulate through you anymore. This is why silence can produce disproportionate reactions. It is not the absence of conversation that unsettles them. It is the loss of leverage. When they cannot access you emotionally, they confront uncertainty. And uncertainty threatens the illusion of superiority, and certainty they work hard to maintain. In that space of destabilization, you may see impulsive decisions, sudden rebounds into new relationships, or dramatic declarations. These are not signs of indifference. They are attempts to quickly rebuild a structure that feels like it is cracking. The urgency is about restoring control, because without control, their internal sense of stability begins to unravel. When you go silent, the narcissistic mind does not interpret it as a boundary. It interprets it as betrayal. Silence becomes proof, at least in their internal narrative, that you have wronged them. This reframing happens quickly and often unconsciously. Accepting that you withdrew because of mistreatment, exhaustion, or self-protection would require accountability. And accountability threatens the ego structure they rely on. So the mind flips the script. Instead of "I hurt them," it becomes "they abandoned me." Instead of "my behavior pushed them away," it becomes "they were never loyal." This psychological reversal protects them from shame. Shame is intolerable for a narcissistic personality. It feels annihilating, not instructive. To avoid that collapse, they externalize blame. In their internal story, you become unstable, overly sensitive, manipulative, or disloyal. Your silence is not seen as strength, it is framed as cruelty. This reframing serves two purposes. First, it preserves their self-image as superior or victimized rather than flawed. Second, it justifies retaliation, indifference, or discard. If you are the villain, they do not have to examine themselves. There is also a cognitive distortion at play: entitlement. They may believe they are owed access to you. When that access is revoked, it feels unjust. The narrative of betrayal restores their sense of moral authority. They were wronged, they were mistreated, they deserve better. What makes this especially powerful is repetition. The more they rehearse this story internally or share it with others, the more real it feels. Allies may be recruited. Mutual acquaintances may hear a skewed version of events. The narrative becomes armor. Underneath that armor, however, there is often a quieter truth they avoid. Your silence reflects a loss of influence. But instead of confronting that vulnerability, the mind clings to the betrayal story. Because in that version, they are still powerful. They are still right. And they never have to face the possibility that their own behavior created the distance. When regret surfaces in a narcissistic mind, it does not look the way most people expect. It is not anchored in empathy. It is not driven by a deep awareness of the pain they caused. Instead, it is self-focused. The regret centers on what they have lost, not on what you endured. At the core of narcissistic functioning is a fragile sense of self that depends on external reinforcement. When you go silent, that reinforcement disappears. Over time, they may begin to feel the absence, not necessarily of you as a person, but of what you provided. Attention, validation, stability, emotional energy, access. When those benefits are gone, a sense of deprivation sets in. That deprivation is often mislabeled as missing you, but for missing supply is not the same as missing connection. Their thoughts may sound like regret. I shouldn't have pushed them away. Maybe I went too far. Yet, if you look closely, the emotional tone is tied to inconvenience and loss of control. The discomfort comes from the realization that something valuable is no longer available. It is about impact on them, their image, their comfort, their ego, not about your healing. Empathy requires the ability to step outside oneself and genuinely imagine another person's internal world. For someone with entrenched narcissistic traits, that capacity is limited or inconsistently accessed. Even when they recognize that you were hurt, the recognition may be intellectual rather than emotional. They understand consequences, not necessarily suffering. There may be brief moments, late at night, during loneliness, when awareness flickers, a memory surfaces, a realization lands, but without deep accountability, that awareness quickly shifts back to self-protection. The mind rationalizes. They were too sensitive. It wasn't that bad. Everyone makes mistakes. So the regret that forms is often about losing control, losing admiration, losing access. It is about the wound to their pride. And unless they engage in serious self-examination, that regret rarely transforms into sustained change or genuine repair. When supply is cut off, obsession often intensifies rather than fades. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, emotional supply is not a luxury, it is regulation. Attention, admiration, conflict, reassurance, even your frustration all serve a function. They confirm significance, they reinforce identity, they stabilize self-worth. When you go silent, that supply line is abruptly severed. At first, they may act indifferent. Pride demands it. But internally, the absence creates a vacuum. Human psychology is wired to fixate on what feels scarce. When something that once responded, reacted, or revolved around them suddenly becomes unavailable, the mind locks onto it. Your silence becomes louder than your presence ever was. They may replay conversations repeatedly, searching for the moment things shifted, not to understand your pain, but to decode how control was lost. They might monitor your social media, ask mutual contacts about you, or create indirect ways of staying informed. Even if they appear to have moved on, mental space can still be occupied by you. This obsession is not always romantic. It is strategic and ego-driven. The unanswered question, why don't they respond, can feel intolerable. The lack of closure becomes a challenge, and challenges activate pursuit. The more unreachable you seem, the more psychologically charged you become. There is also an element of wounded pride. Being ignored disrupts their assumed position of importance. Obsessive thinking can become an attempt to restore that position internally. If they can imagine scenarios where you still care, still miss them, still think about them, they soften the sting of rejection. Ironically, your silence can elevate your perceived value in their mind. What was once familiar becomes rare. What was once accessible becomes restricted. Scarcity increases perceived worth. That shift can intensify hoovering attempts. Sudden messages, nostalgia, vulnerability, or dramatic gestures designed to reopen contact. But this fixation is rarely about shared intimacy. It is about restoring equilibrium. The mind circles around the loss because unresolved ego wounds demand attention. And until a new source of supply fully replaces what was lost, or until access is regained, the obsession can persist beneath the surface. When you go silent, the narcissistic mind does not sit in uncertainty for long. It constructs a narrative. Storytelling becomes a psychological survival tool, because without a coherent explanation that protects their ego, they would be forced to confront vulnerability, shame, or fault, and those states feel intolerable. So the mind edits reality. Memories are reshaped. Conflicts are minimized. Your boundaries are reframed as hostility. Their hurtful behavior becomes justified reactions. This is not always deliberate manipulation. Often, it is an unconscious defense. The brain selectively highlights moments that support innocence and superiority while suppressing moments that threaten self-image. For example, if you withdrew after repeated disrespect, the narrative may become, they overreact to everything. If you left after broken promises, it may transform into, they expect perfection. By simplifying you into a flawed caricature, they protect themselves from complexity. Complexity would require self-examination. This narrative building also serves a social function. They may share their version with friends or family, presenting themselves as misunderstood or mistreated. External validation reinforces the internal story. If others agree, the ego stabilizes further. The more the narrative is repeated, the more it feels like truth. There is also a splitting process that can occur. You may be mentally recategorized from special to disloyal or from ideal to toxic. This sharp shift reduces cognitive dissonance. If you are now the problem, they do not have to reconcile how someone they once idealized chose to walk away. What makes this dynamic powerful is that the narrative is flexible. If they later want to re-enter your life, the story may adjust again. You might suddenly become the one who got away or the only person who understood them. The storyline bends to serve emotional needs in the moment. Ultimately, these constructed narratives are shields. They guard against the deeper question that silence raises. Did my behavior cause this? Rather than face that possibility, the mind chooses coherence over truth. And in that rewritten version of events, their self-image remains intact, even if reality does not. When hoovering begins after your silence, it is rarely about reconciliation. It is about wounded pride. Hoovering, the attempt to pull you back into contact, often emerges when the narcissistic ego feels destabilized and needs restoration. Your silence created a loss of access, and access is tied to power. Regaining your attention becomes symbolic of regaining control. At first, the approach may seem soft, a casual check-in, a nostalgic memory, a just wanted to see how you're doing. This isn't random, it's strategic. The goal is to test whether the door is still open. If you respond, even briefly, you signal that influence remains possible. That small response can feel like relief to them because it reduces the sting of rejection. If subtle attempts fail, the tactics may escalate. Sudden vulnerability can appear. Apologies, emotional confessions, promises of change. In some cases, dramatic gestures surface, grand declarations, urgent requests to talk, or claims of personal crisis. The intensity reflects the depth of the ego wound, not necessarily the depth of love. What drives this behavior is not sustained empathy. It is the discomfort of being ignored. Being unable to reach you challenges their self-perception of importance and desirability. Hoovering becomes a way to prove to themselves that they still matter to you. Even a negative reaction can satisfy this need because reaction equals relevance. There is also competition with the unknown. If they suspect you are moving forward, healing, or connecting with others, their urgency can increase. The idea that you may thrive without them threatens their grandiosity. Reestablishing contact reassures them that they still hold psychological space in your life. If the hoover succeeds and you re-engage, the urgency often subsides quickly. Once equilibrium is restored, the motivation shifts. This is why many people notice a cycle: intense pursuit followed by familiar patterns. The drive was about restoring ego balance. Hoovering, at its core, is an attempt to close the wound your silence created. It is less about repairing the relationship and more about repairing their pride. And when pride, not accountability, is the primary motivator, lasting change is rarely the outcome. True remorse in a narcissistic personality is rare without deep, sustained self-awareness work, because genuine remorse requires dismantling the very defenses that keep their identity intact. To feel authentic regret, a person must tolerate shame, accept responsibility without deflection, and emotionally connect to the harm they caused. For someone organized around narcissistic defenses, those steps feel threatening at a core level. Shame is the central issue. Beneath grandiosity often lies a fragile, easily wounded self-concept. Grandiosity, blame shifting, and denial are not random traits. They are protective structures. If those defenses drop even briefly, the individual may feel exposed, defective, or fundamentally unworthy. That internal experience can feel overwhelming, even destabilizing, so the psyche moves quickly to avoid it. Without structured introspection, often through long-term therapy, moments of awareness do not usually consolidate into change. A narcissistic individual might briefly recognize, "I hurt them," but almost immediately, rationalizations appear. "They pushed me. It wasn't intentional. They're too sensitive." These explanations reduce emotional discomfort and allow the person to retreat back into ego protection. Sustained change requires developing empathy beyond intellectual understanding. It means not only knowing that someone was hurt, but feeling the weight of that reality without collapsing into self-pity or defensiveness. That kind of growth demands consistent accountability, feedback, and a willingness to question long-held narratives about superiority or victimhood. Another barrier is motivation. Often the desire to change arises from consequences, loss of a relationship, damaged reputation, loneliness. But if a new source of validation appears, the urgency to self-reflect diminishes. The external world once again stabilizes the ego, and deeper work feels unnecessary. This is why many apologies, when they happen, focus on restoring connection rather than repairing harm. Words may sound remorseful, but sustained behavioral change is the true indicator. Without ongoing self-examination, old patterns quietly return because the underlying structure remains untouched. Genuine remorse requires courage, the courage to face imperfection without rewriting it. And unless someone commits to that uncomfortable, prolonged inner work, what appears to be regret often remains a temporary response to loss rather than a transformation of character.